ever try to picture something, in your mind's eye and like, fine, there's nothing there.
Yeah.
No picture, no image, just like blankness.
Right.
That's what it's like for someone with aphantasia. It's actually, you might be surprised to learn, it's not as uncommon as you think.
Mhm.
In this deep dive, we're going to be unpacking aphantasia through these audio diaries. Really candid, fascinating stuff by Chris Abraham.
Yeah, you'll hear Chris talk about how he basically lived for 50 years and didn't even realize this was a thing.
It's wild, right?
He just thought mind's eye was, a metaphor.
And the way he figures it out, right? Like, talk about a catalyst for self-discovery. He's watching Space Force.
It's funny where these profound realizations can sometimes hit you, right? But for Chris, hearing a character just casually mention aphantasia, it was like, as he describes it, a bomb went off.
Right.
Suddenly, all these things about his life just clicked into place.
All those times he must felt like he was, like, playing it on hard mode or something. Like, what is everyone else experiencing that I'm not?
Totally. He talks about, like, struggling with memorization back in school, how he'd be envious of classmates who could just, like, visualize flashcards or diagrams.
It's so easy to assume everyone's internal world is the same as ours, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes Chris's story so powerful, I think. It shines a light on how diverse our inner experiences really are. It's not just seeing pictures or not seeing pictures. It's this whole spectrum when it comes to mental imagery.
So for someone listening who's like, wait, hold on. Some people don't experience the world that way. How would you define aphantasia for them?
So aphantasia is basically the inability to create a mental image in your mind voluntarily. Like, imagine trying to picture your childhood home, maybe a loved one's face, and your mind's just blank.
Oh.
That's everyday life for someone with aphantasia.
Wow.
And it's not always, total. There's a spectrum. Some people, it's a complete absence of any visual imagery. Others, it's more like they have varying degrees of difficulty.
And this is where Chris's diaries get super interesting. He talks about experiencing the world through, and this is his phrase, spec sheets, instead of, mental pictures.
It's a really great way to put it.
It's fascinating. He remembers all these details. It's like he's reading off a list, facts and figures.
Yeah, and he gives this great example of when his motorcycle was stolen.
Oh, yeah. Tell me you didn't try to picture that motorcycle when he was describing it.
Well, I totally did. But as Chris is recounting this whole thing, he's rattling off the specs, the make and model, the year, even these custom modifications he'd made. Remembers the police report, the abandoned vehicle sticker they put on it, everything. But he couldn't actually picture the bike itself.
Wow. So he has all the data points, but he can't connect them visually?
It seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, how does someone like Chris experience memories, emotions, even relationships without that visual element?
That's a great question. And it makes you wonder, how does he navigate a world that's so visually driven, especially when it comes to something like relationships? It's funny because he talks about how, he could never relate to that idea of the ick in dating.
Right.
That thing where people are like, he did this and suddenly...
Total turnoff.
Yeah, and it's through this whole thing with the ick that he starts to learn about hyperphantasia.
Which is essentially the opposite, right?
Okay, yeah.
Where people experience these really, really vivid mental images, almost like real life. And so when someone's describing the ick, Chris is like, is this because you're picturing it so clearly in your mind?
So their imagination's working overtime, maybe not in a good way. And I'm sitting here thinking I'm being judgmental when really it's just my brain.
Could be.
But what about the good side, right? Could having a vivid imagination actually make things more enjoyable?
Well, Chris talks about his ex-girlfriend, Betsy, who was obsessed with Paris.
Okay.
She would go every year for work and stay in the same neighborhood. Even called it her neighborhood, even though she was only there for a short time each year.
Which, I get it, Paris, but yeah, Chris thought it was a little ridiculous, right?
He pokes fun at her for it. He couldn't understand how this place she barely spent time in could feel like hers. But now, with this understanding of hyperphantasia, he wonders, was Betsy experiencing Paris so vividly in her mind that it did become a part of her, even without that physical presence?
That's kind of amazing, though, having that kind of internal travel agency revisiting places like that. But it also, makes you realize how easily we misinterpret others when we don't know the difference, and how our brains work.
Totally. It speaks to that need for empathy, for understanding in relationships. We're literally experiencing the world in different ways.
It's true. Speaking of experiencing things differently, Chris also had some interesting things to say about how aphantasia might affect things like, whether someone is susceptible to propaganda or emotional manipulation.
You're talking about how he describes feeling kind of removed from, he calls it apoplectic behavior that he witnesses sometimes.
Right, like people having these huge visceral reactions to the news or whatever, and he's just not getting swept up in it.
Yeah, he theorizes that because he doesn't have those immediate, emotionally charged mental images, he might be more inclined to process information logically and less likely to be swayed by, like, fear-mongering or exaggeration.
Mm.
He even wonders if, the opposite people with hyperphantasia, who can so easily visualize the worst-case scenario,
Yeah.
might be more susceptible to that kind of manipulation.
That's a really interesting thought, though. Like, could how our brains are wired make us more or less vulnerable to that?
It's a fascinating question, one that researchers are still exploring, actually. But it definitely makes you stop and think.
For sure. Now, on a lighter note, he also talks about how aphantasia affects his hobbies, his creative pursuits. Like, he's a huge reader, but he experiences literature in a way that most people would probably find pretty surprising.
He talks about connecting with the beauty of language,
Yeah.
how words evoke emotions, how they tell a story. But he's doing it all without creating those visual images in his mind.
So, no movie in your head alongside the book.
Doesn't sound like it.
I wonder how that translates to other mediums that are visual,
Right.
movies, or even like playing Dungeons and Dragons, something like that.
Well, D&D, he says, is a trip. He feels like an alien visitor trying to navigate this shared imaginary world that everyone else is, like, fully immersed in.
Wow.
It's like he's playing a text adventure relying on rules and logic
Yeah.
instead of, those vivid mental images.
It's so easy to forget that not everyone's internal world is the same. But let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about how this plays out in more, I guess, intimate aspects of life, because Chris gets really honest about how aphantasia affects his experiences with sex and relationships. This is where things get, really interesting, because I think, like, when people think about sex, they often, I don't know, think about the visual element, but for someone like Chris, it's got to be completely different.
Well, he talks about how, this difference in mental imagery might play a role in why some people, particularly women, he says, find the anticipation of a date more enjoyable than the date itself.
Oh,
Have
yeah.
you ever heard that?
All the time. Like, oh, I spent, weeks planning my outfit, fantasizing about this date, and now I can't possibly live up to the hype.
Exactly. And his theory is that people with hyperphantasia, who can create these really vivid mental pictures, might be more prone to that, like building up expectations.
So they're almost like having a relationship with this fantasy in their mind.
Right, which, let's be honest, rarely lives up to reality.
Never. And what's funny is Chris is like, he can't even relate to that. He's just like, what you see is what you get,
Can't access that.
Yeah, there's no mental channel surfing.
Right.
It's just present. It's interesting.
Which, I don't know, blessing or a curse. It really makes you think about how those differences in our brains, like, influence everything.
Expectations, experiences. It's pretty wild.
There's a lot to unpack.
For sure.
And Chris, to his credit, he doesn't shy away from the, I don't know, maybe the more, I guess, vulnerable aspects of realizing this about himself, Like, he talks about feeling, I think, a little envious, maybe, of people who can just escape into their imaginations, especially, like, when it comes to intimacy.
Sure.
He even jokes about wanting, like, to call up all of his exes and be like, okay, now I get it. Now I see why this didn't work out.
Right, like if only I had known.
But in all seriousness, he does talk about being, hesitant to really share about his aphantasia with others,
Yeah.
especially in, like, professional settings, because is it a deficit?
Yeah, exactly. And like he works in a creative field, and so he worries that, it'll be misconstrued, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, you just don't have a good imagination or something.
Right, right.
Which is so not true.
Not at all, yeah.
But it's a shame that he feels like he has to like hide this part of himself, But I think it speaks to this larger thing, which is how we often do equate certain like cognitive abilities, like being able to visualize, with like you're smart or you're capable,
Yeah, your competency.
Yeah.
Totally.
Which is like that's just not the whole picture, clearly.
No, not at all. And Chris's story, I think, highlights that, Neurodiversity is not just a buzzword, right? It's about recognizing and valuing this incredible range of human cognitive experience. And that includes people who think in pictures, people who think in words, all of it.
It's the full spectrum.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on on Chris and his experiences, what are some of the, I don't know, key takeaways that you hope our listeners are walking away with?
Well, first and foremost, there's no right or wrong way to experience the world inside your own head.
Hmm,
Aphantasia is a perfect example. It's not a superpower, it's not a deficit, it's just a different way of being.
I like that.
And second, understanding these differences, I think especially related to mental imagery, can really impact our relationships.
Yeah.
It can increase empathy, reduce those misunderstandings, and ultimately help us connect with each other on a deeper level.
Yeah, taking the time to understand someone's internal world makes a big difference.
It does.
And lastly, I think, Chris's story really just encourages us to be a bit more curious about our own minds, right? Have you ever stopped to really consider how you visualize or imagine or experience the world around you? Like, it's a question worth asking. Who knows, maybe you'll discover something surprising about yourself along the way.
I love that. You've been listening to The Deep Dive. We'll catch you in the next episode.